Imagine an apartment on a Friday night. Not big, not small, just enough for one person. The lighting is adequate. The TV is on, not because there's anything worth watching, but because complete silence feels more uncomfortable. On the table sits a takeout meal that has gone cold. The phone lights up, occasionally notifications from an app, not messages from anyone. The person sitting in that room is not a failure, not strange. They have a stable job, relationships that are sufficient enough that no one worries about them. And if you asked whether they're okay, they would nod and genuinely believe the answer. The problem is that beneath that answer, there is something they have never quite found the words to name. This is the portrait of many people born in the 1980s, who are now living alone between the ages of 35 and 45. And what's unusual about this generation is that they are not easily recognized as a group that is struggling. They are not Gen Z, whose emotional crises are openly shared on social media. They are not baby boomers, with age-related health issues that are visible and expected. They are the generation in between, mature enough that no one checks in on them, but not old enough for their loneliness to be seen as something that naturally deserves attention. They fall into a gap that no one is really looking at. But psychology sees very clearly what is happening inside that gap. And what it finds is not simply a story of loneliness, it is the story of a generation shaped by very specific historical forces, in ways that make them particularly vulnerable when living alone, and particularly unlikely to recognize that they are hurting. That is what we are going to explore today. To understand why people born in the 1980s are particularly vulnerable when living alone, you first have to understand one thing. They are the only generation in modern history that grew up right on the boundary between two completely different worlds. And standing at that boundary, while it may sound interesting, actually leaves a very specific psychological imprint that most of them have never recognized. Their childhood was entirely analog. They grew up with afternoons spent playing outside until evening, with books, with games that required other people to be present. Connection, back then, was something physical and tangible. You had to truly be there, truly look each other in the eye, truly sit next to one another. There was no alternative. Then they stepped into adulthood, and the world changed completely. The internet arrived, social media emerged, smartphones appeared, and they had to learn how to navigate all of it without a map, without anyone ahead of them to show the way, because their parents didn't understand what any of it looked like either. They were the first generation forced to figure out the answer to a question no one had faced before. What does real connection look like in a world where everything is changing faster than anyone can adapt? And here is the most important part. While they were navigating all of those external changes, they were also carrying a very specific kind of emotional baggage, shaped by how they were raised. The parents of the 80s generation, mostly from the baby boomer or silent generation, grew up in environments where the number one priority was material stability. They knew war, scarcity, periods when simply having food and clothing was enough. So what they passed down to their children was not the language of emotion, but resilience. Try harder. Don't complain. Others have it worse than you. These things were not said with bad intentions. They were said by people who genuinely believed this was the best way to prepare their children to face the world. But the psychological consequence of growing up in that environment is a generation that was never equipped with the language to describe what is happening inside them. They learned how to solve problems, how to endure, how to keep moving forward, but they never learned how to sit with their emotions and ask, what is this trying to tell me? What do I actually need right now? And then there is another layer. This generation witnessed a sharp rise in divorce rates during their childhood. Many of them grew up in broken families or saw enough marriages collapse around them that their subconscious formed a quiet belief about long-term relationships, that they don't last, that commitment is risky, that it's safer not to depend too much on anyone. That belief is rarely spoken out loud. It simply sits there, silently shaping how they approach connection throughout adulthood. This is the foundation that people born in the 1980s are standing on as they enter life alone in their mid-30s to mid-40s. Not a foundation of weakness, but a foundation of a generation that was never given enough tools to recognize that living alone and truly being okay are two very different things. And the gap between those two, for many of them, is quietly widening year by year without anyone really noticing. There is a profound difference between living alone and being lonely, And there is also a profound difference between living alone at 25 and living alone at 40. But for many people born in the 1980s who find themselves in that situation today, the boundaries between these states have become so blurred that many no longer know which side of the line they are on. When a 25-year-old lives alone, there is a natural structure surrounding them. Their friends are still single, still free, still open to spontaneous Friday night plans. Life at that age carries a rhythm of movement. Everything is changing, everyone is searching, and being alone is simply a temporary phase within a longer journey. But at 40, it is different. Friends have built families of their own, and their schedules revolve around children and responsibilities you do not share. Spontaneous meetups are gradually replaced by plans made weeks in advance and sometimes cancelled at the last minute because of a sick child or unexpected work. The social network does not disappear entirely, but it shrinks in a way that feels both natural and difficult to resist. And in the space it leaves behind, a certain silence begins to accumulate. Look at an ordinary day in the life of an 80S, born man or woman living alone. They wake up, make coffee, go to work. At the office, they talk with colleagues conversations that are enough to prevent total isolation, but not deep enough to truly touch anything meaningful. In the evening, they return home, eat dinner alone, watch something on a screen, then go to sleep. And if you ask whether anything happened that day, they will say, nothing special. That answer is not a lie. It is simply that they have lived in a state of nothing special for so long that they no longer recognize that their version of normal and the normal of someone who is genuinely connected are two very different things. And this is what psychology makes very clear about chronic isolation. In midlife, it does not arrive as a shock. It comes gradually, year by year, through small decisions that accumulate over time. It might begin with a relationship ending, followed by a decision not to seek someone new right away, because they need time. Then that time stretches longer than expected. Eventually, they grow so accustomed to the rhythm of being alone that the idea of adjusting their life to include someone else feels more exhausting than appealing. Or there may be no specific event at all. Life simply unfolds in a certain direction, and when they look back, they realize they have been alone for longer than they noticed, not because they consciously chose it, but because they never actively chose the alternative. What makes this situation particularly unique for those born in the 1980s is that they have enough awareness to know what is missing. Unlike previous generations who lacked the language to name that feeling, 80S, born individuals have been exposed to enough psychology and mental health content to understand, at least in theory, that human connection matters, that isolation is harmful, that they should do something about it. But knowing and doing are entirely different things. And the gap between the two, the gap between understanding what they need and actually allowing themselves to receive it, is exactly where many 80S born individuals find themselves stuck, without a map for how to get out. No one lives in emptiness without trying to fill it. That is one of the most basic human survival instincts. And people born in the 1980s who live alone are no exception. They have found very specific, very intelligent, and outwardly very normal ways to fill that space. The problem is that what they use to fill it doesn't actually reach what is empty. The first and most common is the screen. Not in the simple sense of phone addiction or watching too much Netflix. Those descriptions are too shallow and miss what is really happening. For 80S, born individuals living alone, the screen is not entertainment. It is background noise. It is turned on the moment they get home, not because there is something they want to watch, but because complete silence in a room with only one person feels heavier than anything playing on the TV. Look at what is actually happening psychologically. The human brain is designed to process social information, voices, faces, the emotions of others. When someone lives alone for a long time, the brain is deprived of that kind of stimulation, and the screen with its faces, voices, and stories creates a simulation just sufficient to keep the brain from going into panic, but not enough to truly meet the need for real connection. It's like drinking salt water when you're thirsty enough for the brain to think the need is being met, but in reality, it deepens the underlying deprivation. The second is work. For people born in the 1980s, especially those living alone, work easily becomes the thing that fills every remaining gap in the day. Not because they are pathologically ambitious, but because work has structure. It gives them a clear purpose, measurable outcomes, and a legitimate reason not to face the emptiness of the evening. At the office or behind a computer screen, they are competent, valuable, and positioned. In the silence of their own room, all of that disappears, leaving only a question they don't know how to answer. How do I actually feel? So they choose not to answer. They open the laptop for another hour. They take on another project. They stay busy in ways that are socially recognized and praised. And that is exactly why it is more dangerous than any obviously self-destructive habit. No one worries about someone who works hard. The third is nostalgia, and this is perhaps the most defining trait of this generation. No generation lives in nostalgia as much as those born in the 1980s, partly because they grew up during a peak era of popular culture, music, films, and video games. From the 80s and 90s became a powerful part of their collective identity. But more importantly, because nostalgia, psychologically, is the most perfect escape mechanism. It allows you to live inside a version of the past that your brain has edited to be better than reality, warmer than reality, and most importantly, free from the need to face anything happening in the present. Look at what happens when an 80s born individual living alone sits and listens to a college-era playlist at 11 p.m. On the surface, it's just a normal evening, but internally, the brain is carrying out a very specific escape, returning to a time when everything still felt open, possible, not yet solidified into irreversible choices. When the present feels too still and too lonely, the past becomes the safest place they know. And then there is something else rarely talked about: the emotional exhaustion that comes from not knowing what you are feeling. Psychology calls this alexithymia, a state in which a person cannot identify or express their own emotions. Not because they don't have emotions, but because for a very long time, they were never taught how to listen to those signals. And when living alone, with no one around to reflect their emotions back to them, the distance between them and their inner world keeps widening. The result is an adult who can go through an entire week without truly knowing whether they are okay or not. Not because nothing is happening in their life, but because their internal sensing system has been numbed long enough that it no longer sends clear signals. And the only thing they know for sure is that they need to fill the evening with something, anything, so they don't have to sit in that silence for too long. This is not laziness or a lack of willpower. It is the inevitable consequence of living too long in a state where real emotional needs are never met. And gradually, even they stop recognizing that those needs are still there. If you ask most people born in the 1980s who are living alone whether they need help, the answer will almost certainly be no. Not because they are truly okay, but because throughout their lives, asking for help was never taught as a valid option. And this is important to understand. This is not arrogance, not stubbornness. This is the result of a very long and very quiet process that they were never consciously part of. Look at what happens when an 80s born individual is going through a genuinely difficult period. Not an obvious crisis, but a kind of chronic, quiet struggle without a clear name. They wake up feeling heavy without knowing why. They go to work, complete their tasks, come home, and repeat. Each day passes well enough that there is no real reason to call anyone. But accumulated over time, those days are eroding something inside them that they don't have the words to name. And even when they realize they are not okay, what is the next step? Who do they call? What do they say? This generation grew up in a culture where sharing emotions, especially those without clear solutions, was implicitly understood as a burden to others. You don't call a friend at 11 p.m. just to say you feel empty and don't know why. You don't text someone to say you've gone an entire week without having a real conversation with anyone. These things have no clear social script, and for someone who was never equipped with emotional language, no script means no way to begin. But there is an even deeper layer that few people talk about. For those who, in the 1980s, especially those who have lived alone for a long time, their identity has been built around that independence, not as a conscious choice, but as something that formed gradually over time. They are the ones who take care of themselves, the ones who don't need reminders, the ones everyone assumes will be fine no matter what happens. And that identity, even though it was built from a place of lack, becomes the only thing they are certain about. So asking for help is not just admitting that they are struggling. For them, it threatens the entire version of themselves that they have spent years building. It calls into question the one thing that feels stable in their lives, the image of someone who doesn't need anyone. And the brain, when faced with a threat to identity, will do everything it can to protect that image, even if it means continuing to sink in silence. There is another factor that makes this situation even more complex, especially for this generation's social media. People born in the 1980s are the first generation to come of age alongside platforms like Facebook and Instagram, where other people's lives are presented in their most polished form. And when you are sitting alone in a quiet room on a Saturday night, then open your phone and see friends posting family photos, travel photos, crowded dinners, the brain does not process that as curated content. It processes it as evidence that everyone else is doing fine, staying connected, living more fully than you. The result is a very cruel paradox. Social media becomes both the only thing that gives them a sense of connection to the outside world and the strongest reinforcement of the belief that they are the only ones who are not okay. And when you believe that you are the only one who is not okay, asking for help becomes even harder because beyond the fear of being a burden, there is the added shame of being the only one who hasn't figured out how to live correctly. And so they continue. They keep filling their evenings with screens. They keep pouring more hours into work. They keep answering, "I'm fine," when asked. Not because they want to continue this way, but because every path toward the opposite requires them to do something no one ever taught them how to do. To put down the identity of someone who needs no one, and honestly admit that they do. If you've made it this far and recognize yourself in what's been described the Friday night with a cold takeout box, the college-era playlist at 11 p.m., the feeling of just normal becoming the default answer to every question, then there is something I want to say to you, directly. Not, "You're not alone." Not, "Love yourself more." Those statements may be true in theory, but they don't touch what you are actually feeling, because if they did, you wouldn't still be reading this. What I want to say is this. There is a profound difference between choosing to live alone and gradually becoming so accustomed to it that you no longer remember you once wanted something different. Your generation was not given the tools to distinguish between those two, not because you are not intelligent, but because no one taught you how to look inward long enough to recognize the difference. And this is what psychology makes very clear about chronic isolation. It does not hurt in a way you can point to and say, "This is my problem." It hurts in the form of absence. The absence of real conversations. The absence of someone who knows how your day went, not because you posted it online, but because they genuinely asked. The absence of feeling seen not by many people, but by just one person in a way that requires no explanation or proof. Healing from this state does not begin with a big decision. It does not begin with suddenly opening up to everyone or completely changing how you live. For a nervous system that has adapted to independence for many years, large and sudden changes don't work. They only trigger more resistance. It begins with things much smaller. So small they are almost invisible. The first time you answer honestly when someone asks if you're okay, even if it's just one sentence, even if it's just with one person. The first time you sit in the silence of your room without immediately turning on the TV, and instead of escaping it, you ask what it is trying to tell you. The first time you call someone not because you have a specific reason, but simply because you want to hear their voice. These things may seem too small to make a difference, but for a nervous system that has gone a long time without real connection, those moments are not small at all. They are the first evidence your brain receives that opening up does not necessarily lead to harm, that needing someone does not mean losing yourself, that there is a version of life where you can be both independent and connected, and the two are not in conflict. You have spent many years learning how to live without needing anyone, and that has carried you through a great deal. But the real question is not whether you can continue living that way clearly. You can. The real question is, do you want to? And if there is even a small part of you that answers no, then that is exactly the part worth listening to.